Alright, in this lesson we're going to cover hypervisor evolution and the different type of hypervisors. So actually there is two types of hypervisors, and you could say generation of hypervisors out there. Type 1 and Type 2 hypervisors. It's important to distinguish between the two because the Type 1 hypervisor is meant for production, whereas Type 2 hypervisor were meant for test and development and being used in your personal virtual machine. It's unfortunate that many IT professionals in the market today who actually even worked with virtualization for a few years still couldn't distinguish between the two types of hypervisors and their use cases. So it's important to distinguish between the two to be successful, as well to use the right hypervisor type for the right purpose. The reason as well I'm going through the hypervisor evolution, understanding how the hypervisor has evolved through time would make it much easier for you to distinguish between the two types of hypervisors out there. Alright, so let's start with Type 2 hypervisors. So Type 2 hypervisor actually was the first type of hypervisor to surface for x86, and you could call it in a different name as a hosted hypervisor. So Type 2 hypervisor is really a hosted hypervisor. So a lot of the time you're going to hear the name hosted hypervisor rather than being called as Type 2 hypervisor. What they mean by hosted hypervisor, that it's running over a generic operating system. So the way this hypervisor is being installed, you actually bring the server you're going to install the server or the physical box you're going to install the hypervisor on. Then you install it first with a generic operating system, and that usually Windows or Linux, just as you see here. So you got the physical box, CPU, memory, network, and disk resources. You installed a generic host operating system on it, so that could be Windows or Linux. And the top of that, you install the hypervisor as an application. So if you remember the VMware Workstation demo I gave in an earlier lesson, in the What's Virtualization lesson, you remember that was installed as a VMware Workstation was installed as an application in Windows machine. So it's installed over another operating system. Then on top of that, you start actually installing the OS and so on. You create your virtual machine and you install the OS and application within that virtual machine. Being installed over a generic operating system or over Linux, which is could be Linux or Windows, that means that hypervisor is not controlling the resources of the server directly. So it's not controlling CPU and memory directly. And the scheduling of these resources is actually managed by the host operating system. So that's actually managed by the Windows or Linux machine sitting below the hypervisor. That host operating system provides a chunk of that resources to the virtualization layer to manage and use, but it doesn't give it all the power and let it manage the hardware directly. It's managing it through the scheduler of the operating system itself. The other thing, the operating system or the host operating system here is what will be providing the drivers and the management of the drivers for the hardware required. So all that work is done through the host operating system. One thing to as well remember, as I mentioned earlier, Type 2 hypervisor is not production ready. These guys are actually meant mainly for test and development or personal usage. Some examples of Type 2 hypervisor, or as I would like to call them, hosted hypervisors, is VMware Workstation, VMware Fusion for Mac, VMware Player, Microsoft Virtual PC, VirtualBox. All these hypervisor work in the same way. They installed as an application over a generic operating system. Alright, I know we have demoed VMware Workstation before, but just to grasp the concept even better of Type 2 hypervisor, let's go through a real demo here for just a second. Alright, so this is my Windows machine. So I'm running Windows 7 natively on my box. Then on top of that, I have VMware Workstation running. So VMware Workstation actually have been installed as a normal application in my Windows machine. So if I go actually even to, let's say, to add and remove programs in my Windows machine, which is called Program and Features in Windows 7, I should be able to spot VMware Workstation. Okay, I think it's a bit. Yeah, as you can see, VMware Workstation have been installed in there. So that's actually installed as a normal application. So VMware Workstation, as you see, have been installed on my Windows 7 machine. On top of that, I could actually create virtual machines like the one here, which is running Ubuntu. I could create another Windows machines and so on and run whatever application I need to it. But the main concept here is being hosted, so it's actually really running over a second operating system. You can't install it directly on the hardware, so I have to install another operating system before I install it. Alright, so let's go back to... Alright, so let's talk about Type 1 Hypervisor. So the main difference between Type 1 Hypervisor and Type 2. Type 1 can be totally installed directly or bare metal on the hardware you buy. So you can buy your hardware, which could be your physical server from your preferred vendor like IBM, Dell, HP. And rather than having to install Windows or Linux on top of that box, you go actually and install the hypervisor directly on it. So for a VMware example, our our Type 1 hypervisor is called VMware ESXi. So you can go and get the VMware ESXi CD, boot your server from it, and get it installed directly on the host. So you don't require an operating system, a generic operating system, to be installed below your hypervisor. Your hypervisor is installed directly on the hardware itself. And that's give the hypervisor the advantage of being able to directly control the resources of the physical box, and control the scheduling of it. As well, the hypervisor in here is the one who's providing all the driver works. So the other thing which is a characteristic of Type 1 hypervisor, or non-hosted hypervisor, so that's non-hosted hypervisor. Remember, Type 2 was hosted hypervisor. Type 1 is non-hosted hypervisor. Non-hosted hypervisor or Type 1 hypervisor is production workload ready. So that's actually what you want to run in production. So if you have production VMs that you want to run, that's where you want to run them, as a Type 1 hypervisor or non-hosted hypervisors. Example of non-hosted hypervisors is VMware ESXi, and that's what our course will be focused on. It's the VMware ESXi. As well, other non-hosted hypervisor or Type 1 hypervisor is VMware ESX, Microsoft Hyper-V, Citrix Xen Server. Alright, here putting Type 1 and Type 2 hypervisors side to side just to make the comparison a bit easier. As you see, in Type 1 hypervisor, we did not require an operating system below the hypervisor, where in Type 2 you required an operating system. Just like you saw in my VMware Workstation, it was installed over Windows 7. Then on top of that, I put my hypervisor. In Type 1, I actually go and install the hypervisor directly on the hardware. In upcoming lessons, we're gonna go and install VMware ESXi, and I will show you how it go and install directly on the hardware itself. And by that, it could actually manage directly everything with the hardware, the resource scheduling, as well as drivers. As well as we mentioned, Type 1 is what you want to use for production. Type 2 you would use for your personal use, your test, and development. Okay, so advantages of Type 1 hypervisors: availability and reliability. Now your hypervisor actually doesn't depend on the availability and reliability of the operating system sitting below it, like in Type 2. Remember, in Type 2 hypervisor, like VMware Workstation, it doesn't matter how reliable is VMware Workstation is, as it depends always on the reliability of the OS below it. So if Windows 7, which was below my VMware Workstation, crashed, my VMware Workstation will crash too. Whereas in Type 1 hypervisor, as I don't have an operating system below it, the only way my hypervisor will crash if there's a bug or a problem with the hypervisor, as it doesn't depend on an OS below it. Real-time performance. The performance of virtual machines running on Type 1 hypervisor or non-hosted hypervisor is always much better than Type 2 hypervisor. The reason for that is it's actually pushing all the I/O directly to the hardware rather than having to go through the operating system. So there is no interrupt latency like in Type 2 hypervisor, where everything has to go through the OS. The hypervisor is directly managing the hardware and the scheduling rather than having to depend on the OS doing that. The third advantage of Type 1 hypervisor is determinism. you can much easier determine what's the problem or where's the bottleneck of performance when you're running type 1 hypervisor, because you don't have to go and debug for the operating system sitting below it. It's actually the bottleneck caused by the host operating system, or it's caused by hypervisor. That's usually a question that raises a lot when you're using type 2 hypervisors. You don't have to ask to question that with type 1 hypervisor because you don't have on host OS. Footprint, type 1 hypervisor is much smaller because you don't require the operating system below it. Security, again, doesn't matter how secure is your type 2 hypervisor, as because it's always exposed to the host OS sitting below it security concerns. So if you have a loophole that affects Windows 7, it would affect my VMware workstation that you showed on the earlier demo. Where with a type 1 hypervisor like VMware E6i, I don't have a hosted OS below it, so the only security concern I have is the security concern of my hypervisor. I don't have to be concerned about the host OS below it. Configurability, or from development perspective, so the developer who's developing a type 1 hypervisor have much more flexibility and configuration flexibility than somebody who's developing a type 2 hypervisor, because now he could manage the hardware directly, not have to depend on the restrictions that's coming from the host OS below it if I were to do type 2 hypervisors. Okay, so the evolution of VMware hypervisors. It's like seeing the evolution of how the hypervisor have evolved will actually make it much easier to figure out the difference between type 1 and type 2 hypervisors and how they started. So actually the first VMware hypervisor that were introduced in 1999, and that was actually the first x86 hypervisor to hit the market, was VMware Workstation. So it was actually a type 2 hypervisor, or let's say a hosted hypervisor, where you actually, as you saw, you install an operating system below it, then you install the hypervisor, which is VMware Workstation in this case, then you go and create your virtual machines and install the operating system application inside of it. VMware Workstation was totally dependent on the OS below it. If that OS have crashed or you have to log out of that OS, you'd have to shut down your VMware Workstation. And that was meant mainly for test and development. The next hypervisor that was introduced in 2001, VMware GSX, which got renamed later on to VMware Server, was introduced. The main difference between the VMware GSX and the VMware Workstation, that it was running as a service. So more than one user could use it. It had actually a web interface that multiple users could access the machine remotely from. You could log off the machine and that affected the virtual machines running on it. Though it still was running over an operating system, Windows or Linux, so it was still hosted hypervisor. All the resources and scheduling was done mainly through the Windows operating system or Linux operating system sitting below it, as well. That's who's managed the drivers. There was a breakthrough in technology of hypervisor in 2003 when VMware introduced the VMware ESX hypervisor, which was able to be installed totally per metal right on the top of the hardware. You didn't need an operating system below it, so it totally managed the hardware resources. It was much more secure because you don't have an operating system sitting below it. It was more reliable because you don't have, again, an operating system sitting below it. And it managed directly the hardware, as we said. So you actually, with the VMware ESX, you go and bring your server, physical server, and just boot it from the ESX CD and install the hypervisor. You didn't need any Windows or any Linux under it. In 2007, another breakthrough in the hypervisor technology have came up, where VMware have decided the service console, which is actually used to be a Linux partition that was coming as a part of the VMware ESX, is not required anymore. And it decided actually by removing that, we actually increase the security and we require less patching that was required for this Linux partition, which was a part of the VMware ESX. This VMware Service Console was the main purpose of it was to provide the management features of the VMware ESX. So at VMware were able to move all these management features to the VM kernel itself and remove any reliance to any generic operating system totally out of the picture, which is a great advantage. So by that have been able to actually shrink the size of the hypervisor itself, increase its security even farther, and increase its reliability even farther. Going forward, actually, with VMware, the only type 1 hypervisors in the market it's introduced to the market is the VMware ESXi. It's actually discontinued the VMware ESX, as this includes a much better reliability and security footprint than the ESX have done. Going forward, actually, with our training here, VMware ESXi what we're gonna focus on, and that's what mainly used in 80% of the virtualized data centers today in the market. That's what everybody is using for their production environment. For test and dev, a lot of people still use VMware Workstation. But when it comes to production, VMware ESXi what's being used and what we're going to be focused on in this training. And it's important always to remember that's actually a bare metal hypervisor. You don't install any operating system below it. You just install it directly on the hardware itself. So summary, what you should have learned from this lesson, the difference between type 1 and type 2 hypervisors. It's mainly type 1 is non-hosted hypervisor, type 2 is a hosted hypervisor. So in type 2 you require an operating system to sit below it, managing the scheduling and the hardware, where type 1 is directly per metal, so directly to the hardware, managing the hardware in its own. Advantages of type 1 hypervisor, as I mentioned, it's more secure because it has less footprint and it doesn't require an OS below it, so it's not affected by generic operating system loopholes. It's more reliable. Again, it doesn't have to count for any unreliability if an operating system is sitting below it. It's much smaller footprint. It's give the developer of the hypervisor itself much more control in the hardware. Alright, then we talked as well about the VMware Hypervizor Evolution. So as you saw, VMware have evolved from the VMware Workstation, which is a Type 2 hypervisor, all the way to VMware ESX, which is a Type 1 hypervisor. Then it even evolved further to VMware ESXi by removing the Service Console, which was the Linux partition, living with the VMware ESXi. So removing any dependency on any generic operating system with the VMware ESXi. Going forward, what we're going to be talking about mostly is the VMware ESXi as the production-ready hypervisor that's out there in the market today, and that's being used by most virtualized data center, and that's the production-ready hypervisor from VMware that's being recommended for every data center today.